What would happen if every human being on Earth disappeared? This isn't the story of how we might vanish. It's the story of what happens to the world we leave behind. In this episode, life after people takes to the skies. What will happen to some of the best-known planes in the world? What strange flying creatures will black out the sun? How might this spacecraft change the universe? And how did this secret place, designed to protect man from airborne Armageddon, become a post-apocalyptic nightmare? Welcome to Earth. Population 0. For a creature so bound to the Earth, mankind's dreams often took him to the skies. But what will become of the flying machines humans use to conquer the air? And what will seize control of the skies? One day after people. Air Force One, possibly the most recognized plane in the world, sits empty on the tarmac of Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. 63 feet longer than the White House, it has the body of a Boeing 747. Its 2 kitchens, soundproofed conference room, and a secure communications bay made Air Force One unlike any other aircraft in the world.
There is an enormous amount of extra equipment on board Air Force One. Equipment that you would never see on a private jetliner or a regular commercial jet.
The equipment included an array of top-secret defense systems. There was a risk that the plane could be a target for missiles, so Air Force One carried an ingenious countermeasure. If a heat-seeking missile locked onto the plane, a series of false target flares would shoot out, generating more heat than the engines themselves and diverting the missile. Air Force One was a flying fortress.
Aircraft are not designed to sit around not being maintained. Air Force One has more stuff in it that can go wrong than any other 747s in the world.
In a life after people, a minor malfunction could lead to a high-level failure. Two days after people. The highest mountain on Earth no longer welcomes any climbers. At over 29,000 feet, the summit of Mount Everest reached nearly as far into the sky as most commercial airliners. The final 3,000 feet to its summit was called the death zone. Because there's so little oxygen at this height, the human body could not sustain itself.
You've got 1/3 the oxygen that you have at sea level. Basically, you're going to have acute mountain altitude sickness. And as it gets worse, you get fluid in the lungs or fluid in the brain. And as that progresses, people are going to die.
With every ounce of energy needed to survive, climbers routinely left behind food tins, plastics, used oxygen bottles, and anything that wasn't essential. In 1994, climber Brent Bishop organized a cleanup effort that removed over 12 tons of rubbish from the mountain. But with 400 climbers a season, litter continued to be a problem. And one day after people, the mountain's mighty glaciers conceal even greater secrets that aren't going to vanish in the thin air. Three days after people. Although some battery-powered radios are still on, the broadcasts have ceased. Nearly 15,000 radio stations once beamed news, talk, and music across the United States every day. Now, with people gone and the power failing, radio across the country signs off forever. Yet there's one place in the American Southwest
This is K-Tow's 1019.
where the airwaves still crackle with the voice of man.
Blues and sweet sounds from all over the world.
New Mexico radio station K-Tow was completely solar powered.
The cleanest sound on Earth.
And because of its remote location, it was engineered for a computer to take over when humans weren't there.
Best in reggae, blues, and sweet sounds.
In the northern part of the state, music and announcements beam across the empty land
Home of solar radio.
without any human
A
input.
little sunshine in your ears with zero emissions radio.
"4 days after people. Airports that were once full of passengers are empty. And so are the skies around the world. In the time of humans, there were more than 5,000 flights in United States airspace alone at any given moment. Now, there are none. This had happened only 4 other times in modern aviation history. 3 times in the 1960s when the US military cleared the skies to test their radar warning system. And most recently, after the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. For 3 days after 9/11, commercial flights were grounded. Scientists noticed a surprising side effect. Each day the airliners were not flying, the average difference between the high and low temperatures across the United States increased by 2 degrees. But why? Normally, jet plane contrails spread out in the sky, creating a thin but significant layer of artificial clouds. Some atmospheric scientists believed that this layer kept the Earth a little warmer at night, like a blanket, and cooler during the day, because it reflected some of the sun's heat. In a life after people, the absence of this artificial cloud cover could rapidly change the climate on Earth. One week after people, seagulls and Canada geese flock to airports, taking advantage of the peace and quiet.
Canada geese like to graze. They're basically flying cows. The thing that attracts gulls to airports is the big open space. They like to have what we call loafing areas, where they can sit and rest and see any danger approaching.
In the time of humans, the greatest danger was from aircraft. In the United States, bird strikes occurred 20 times a day on average. In 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 suffered complete engine failure when it ran into a flock of geese just after takeoff. Only a miraculous landing on the Hudson River by pilot Chesley Sullenberger prevented a catastrophic crash. But collisions between birds and planes didn't begin in the jet age. The first recorded bird strike was in 1905. And the pilot was Orville Wright. But of all the aircraft that revolutionized the world of man, one of the most iconic was the Spirit of St. Louis. Piloted by Charles Lindbergh, it was the first plane to be flown solo across the Atlantic. Many believed that it was this daring achievement that convinced the public that the skies did indeed belong to mankind. 1 week after people, the plane is still aloft. Because it hangs from the ceiling of America's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Suspended by 3 cables that loop through ordinary bolts, how long will it be before the renowned aircraft makes its final flight? One month after people. The tallest structure in North America still stands. It's not the Empire State Building, or the Sears Tower, or Canada's CN Tower. It's the 2,063-foot-high KVLY television tower in North Dakota. Broadcast towers are usually placed atop hills, mountains, or existing skyscrapers. But on the Great Plains, building high was the only way to reach an audience of 240,000 households spread out over more than 15,000 square miles. The galvanized steel frame was engineered to withstand severe winter storms and 85-mile-an-hour winds. But now, the tremendous height of this tower makes it a vulnerable target for nature's arsenal. It has happened before.
Their failures, and there have been many, are spectacular.
Six months after people. Of all the trees growing worldwide, the tallest is the coast redwood in Northern California at 379 feet. With a lifespan that can stretch for 2,000 years, a tree that was a seedling when Jesus was born could have been flown over by a plane in the 21st century. In the time of humans, people sought to protect these trees by suppressing forest fires. Now, with no firefighters to beat back the flames, wildfires burn unchecked. But redwoods are hard to kill. When fire burns their leaves, it triggers a signal in the tree to sprout new limbs and shoots. While their competitors are often destroyed, redwoods quickly flourish again. And although man is gone, some other creatures from Earth are rocketing towards a new frontier. One year after people. The plane that was Air Force One has begun to rust on the tarmac of Andrews Air Force Base. The tarmac was once kept pristine by a ground team that scoured the runway for debris before each flight. Now, nature has already begun to reclaim it. We know this because there's an abandoned airport in Berlin that already shows what life is like 1 year after people. Tempelhof. In 2008, the enormous terminal was closed to air traffic. But it was once at the heart of the biggest air relief operation in history. 6 decades ago, these runways were a frenzy of air traffic in one of the first major struggles of the Cold War, the Berlin airlift.
It was a constant sound in the air of those incoming airplanes. Every 90 seconds there was traffic on those runways.
In 1948, Berlin was deep inside Soviet-occupied Germany. The city was divided in half between the Soviets and the West. When a struggle for territorial control boiled over, the Russians blockaded West Berlin, cutting off access to food and supplies by ground. West Berliners faced starvation or surrender.
The threat for the West Berliners was that we then would have been taken by the Russians and would have finally lost our freedom.
The West responded with an airlift. Fully loaded cargo planes roared in and out of Tempelhof every minute and a half, ferrying up to 13,000 tons of food and supplies each day. After 10.5 months, the Soviets lifted the blockade, and Tempelhof became known as the airport that saved the city. Shut down in the 21st century, after a more modern airport opened outside the city, its ticket counters are empty. Its vast hallways are filled only with shadows. And wild grass obscures signs on the runways that once made history. Three years after people. In the wilderness of Yellowstone National Park, a tiny flying creature that once terrified North Americans has returned. The Rocky Mountain locust. Locusts were a common sight in the 19th century. Swarms that often covered 2,000 square miles blackened the skies from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. Like a biblical plague, wherever they landed, the ravenous mass devoured every blade of vegetation.
They're pelting you, they're landing, crawling up into your clothing. It's like a horrific rainstorm or a hailstorm of locusts as they cover everything.
In 1875, one swarm was so massive, it was deemed the largest single gathering of living creatures in recorded history.
Nothing comes close to this enormous swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts in 1875. That swarm was approximately 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide. If we had squared them up, they would have covered the state of Colorado border to border.
But in the late 19th century, settlers began farming the insect's fragile habitat in the river valleys of the upper Rocky Mountains. Within 25 years, the locusts had disappeared. Only a few small pockets may have survived in pristine areas like Yellowstone National Park. Three years after people, the population of a surviving pocket of locusts grows in the absence of humans. Might the ravaging swarms that once terrified settlers return? 5 years after people. Most aeroplanes are deteriorating slowly. But Air Force One has hidden potential for sudden disaster. One weakness is a defense system called false target flares that diverts heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft. The electrical circuits that trigger it were not designed to be left unmaintained.
The flare circuits, they are a major point of failure. These things are dangerous if just left in place. They deteriorate very quickly.
When a circuit fails, it deploys the flares. The plant growth on the tarmac below becomes kindling for a mammoth blaze. And the plane itself has plenty of fuel to feed the fire. Unlike most planes, Air Force One's 50,000-gallon fuel tanks were kept filled in case the president had to be flown out of harm's way at a moment's notice. But now, there is no one to move Air Force One out of danger. Eight years after people, a spacecraft called Cassini silently orbits Saturn 750 million miles from Earth. In the time of humans, it generated countless revelations about the ringed planet and our solar system. Now, it's alone, in the freezing void of space. Well, not quite alone.
In the innards of the Cassini spacecraft, there are probably very, very hardy bacteria which hitched a ride on the mission.
They're called extremophiles.
We know that these extremophiles can survive very harsh conditions. We find them in the dry valleys of Antarctica. We find them in the Yellowstone mud pots. We find them in basically every environment, no matter how harsh.
These hardy bacteria were believed to stow away on all kinds of space vehicles. To make sure there'd be no unintended consequences from these microorganisms crash landing on another world, NASA planned to end Cassini's mission by incinerating it in Saturn's atmosphere. But now, without mission control to order its demise, Cassini and its tiny stowaways are on a voyage into uncharted territory. "10 years after people. Airports are already crumbling. Many simply weren't built to last.
Architects are quite humble about airports. A terminal building often doesn't last more than 40 or 50 years before it's massively redesigned. So we have the ultimate disposable building.
There were some exceptions, like the otherworldly LAX theme building at Los Angeles International Airport. This architectural landmark was built in 1961 to resemble a landing spacecraft. It was called the Theme Building to usher in a jet-age future for the airport. By 2010, it was one of the few surviving airport buildings of its era, thanks to a 2-year renovation that strengthened it to withstand the test of time. 10 years after people, its arches dominate the empty airport. And it will continue to endure because of a surprising form of protection that will keep it safe from nature's most powerful forces. But there's no protection for the buildings of a little-known enclave that once safeguarded North America from an airborne Armageddon. Now, it faces an apocalypse of its own. "10 years after people. The places that once protected mankind from nuclear annihilation now face their own destruction. It's a future that has already happened here at Edgar Radar Station. Edgar once looked like an ordinary town, but the entire site was constructed in 1952 for a single purpose: to scan the skies for an airborne apocalypse.
The Defense Department realized that the Russians would be able to build plenty of nuclear weapons, put them in bombers, fly the bombers over the North Pole, and destroy targets in Canada and in the United States.
Situated about 80 miles north of Toronto, Edgar was large enough to be a self-contained town and self-sufficient as a matter of security.
We had everything: dentists, we had doctors, we had messing facilities, a recreation center with an indoor swimming pool.
More than 300 people lived and worked on the base, which hummed with daily life. Now, stools in the station's cafe sit long empty. A tree branch sprawls across the roof of an abandoned home. The floor of the old gym is in ruins, and some buildings have already been demolished.
This is what's left of the single men's barracks. You can actually see the tile still on what was once the inner floor, and you can see where the walls and corridors actually laid out.
The entire enclave was built to support a single technology: radar. It scoured the northern skies 24 hours a day for an attack by Soviet planes laden with atomic bombs.
The more that the United States and Canada knew about Russian intentions, the less chance there was for someone to make a mistake and push the button.
Radar's electromagnetic waves could pierce the sky for 200 miles. If a plane was in that radius, waves would bounce back from it, providing critical information about where the plane was and how fast it was flying. This made Edgar part of the United States' first early warning system, but it also put the base near the top of the enemy target list.
Radar can be homed in on by the coming forces, and naturally the Soviet Union would like to knock our eyes out so we couldn't see them. So we were very vulnerable here.
Life at Edgar was always on edge.
Very tense. It was very tense for everyone.
For 12 years, Edgar's radar scoured the skies. In 1964, the station was made obsolete by a longer-range radar base needed for a new threat: intercontinental missiles. Over the years, as attack times shrank from hours to minutes, the job of advance warning rose to the ultimate vantage point: satellites in outer space. Although the radar operations at Edgar were removed, the rest of the base was used by civilians until 1999, when it was closed for good. Ten years of decay have taken their toll. The cinema has an audience of none. A children's playground is overrun by nature. The single women's dorm has long been empty. Its entryway has faded, but not the memories of what once happened here.
She was standing right there, and I got down on my hands and knees, and I said, "Joy, will you marry me?"
The gymnasium that hosted rowdy games is now home to birds. Celebrations once held here are now distant memories.
This is where Joy and I, my fiancée, went and celebrated our engagement at the New Year's Eve ball for the rest of the base.
Now, the floors have buckled almost beyond recognition.
The green line here is the outer bound line for basketball court. Very small amount of water has actually caused this damage. If you think about it, these little drops of water have created a wave of wood.
The community that once searched the skies for an attack is now under assault from above. In this new war, the buildings of Edgar are defenseless.
You're listening to K-Tow's 1019.
15 years after People.
It's the cleanest sound on Earth.
Powered by the sun, radio station K-Tow broadcasts some of the last human voices to be heard on Earth.
Reggae, blues, and sweet sounds from all over the world. This is K-Tow's 1019.
Inside the computer that automatically plays the music, the bearings of a cooling fan grind to a halt. Across the windswept hills of the southwest, birds still chirp. Coyotes howl. But as the station computer overheats, the music of mankind falls forever silent. "20 years after People. The Cassini spacecraft continues to orbit Saturn. But Saturn has more than 50 moons, making any orbit fraught with peril. Now the spacecraft crashes into one of these moons. It should be the last of Cassini. But this moon has something that was never expected in the frigid depths of space around Saturn. "30 years after People. On the distant horizon of a peaceful prairie, a dark cloud begins to blot out the sun. Within minutes, a frenzied crush of insects from a massive swarm pours out of the sky. Once so few in numbers, many scientists believed they were extinct, the Rocky Mountain locust has returned.
We're hesitant to use the E word in ecology and entomology, that E word being extinction. And the reason is what we call the Lazarus effect.
The term Lazarus effect is used when a species thought to be extinct is rediscovered, as if risen from the dead. The return of the locusts is linked to their cousins that live just outside Yellowstone Park. Grasshoppers. In Life After People, grasshoppers are no longer controlled by pesticides, and their numbers explode. The birds that kept locusts in check for decades now gorge on grasshoppers instead. For the first time in more than a century, locusts flourish. When they sense their territory is becoming overcrowded, instinct tells them to take to the air en masse in search of more food. 30 years after People, the Rocky Mountain locust swarms into the skies of the American Midwest once again. "35 years after People. Some of the highest glaciers in the world continue to inch down Mount Everest. Entombed within the ice is the rubbish that climbers leave behind. They believed the colossal ice would crush it into smithereens.
There was this theory that the glacier with the millions of tons of ice would just grind up whatever trash was dumped into the crevasse into dust. But they found that, 30, 40 years later, things came out at the foot of the glacier relatively intact.
35 years after People. A length of rope with a climber's glove still curled around it emerges from the glacial ice. And the frozen citadel has one more secret inching its way down the mountain. "50 years after People. The KVLY Tower, the tallest structure in North America, still soars the equivalent of more than 150 stories high into the North Dakota sky. It was built to withstand almost all forms of extreme weather, except severe ice and wind. Just 3 feet shorter was the second tallest structure in North America, the TV tower of a sister station, KXJB, located less than 10 miles away. In April 1997, when a severe ice storm struck, the fierce wind and weight of the ice sent the second highest structure crashing to the ground. Five decades after People, another ice storm blows in, buffeting the nearly 450-ton tower. As the ice builds up, it adds many tons of additional weight to the structure. The huge stress of the extra weight shears section bolts off, snapping the tower in the middle. The top of the tower plummets for more than 10 seconds, accelerating to nearly 250 miles per hour before smashing into the earth. Its reign as the tallest structure on the continent is cut short. On America's east coast, the spirit of St. Louis rocks in the wind that whistles through the National Air and Space Museum. In 1976, curators had the plane carefully inspected. Apart from minor rust and small tears in the cotton fabric of the fuselage, the aircraft was still fit to fly. The weakness now is not with the plane, but the system that holds it aloft. The 3 cables and clamps that secure it to the ceiling are strong enough to hold 5 times the weight of the plane. But the cables loop through standard steel bolts never designed to withstand decades rocking in the wind. Exposure to the elements combines with the chafing of the cable to weaken the bolts until each fails. And the plane that so sensationally opened the doors to global air travel makes one final flight. The fate of high-flying relics is just one of civilization's many falls. Another otherworldly crash will plant some startling new seeds. "125 years after people. The only 2 buildings remaining at Los Angeles Airport are the steel-reinforced control tower and the LAX theme building. In the time of humans, seismologists discovered a major fault line just a few miles away. They calculated that the odds of a massive earthquake occurring within 125 years were 1 in 8. As part of the overhaul of the theme building in 2010, engineers installed 600 tons of steel on rubber rollers to counteract the devastating shockwaves of a major quake. Called a mass damper, these systems are usually placed underneath or inside buildings. But the space-age architecture of the theme building made that impossible.
Think about the theme building. 4 stilts, not really connected to one another until you get up to the restaurant level. And you'd want the 4 stilts to all move perfectly together. There would be no way to guarantee that in an earthquake.
Instead, it became the first building in North America with a mass damper on the roof. 125 years after people, when a violent 6.5 magnitude quake strikes at dawn, the mass damper saves the theme building, leaving it the only structure at the airport still standing. "5,000 years after people. A glacier on Mount Everest is in spring melt once again. What thaws is a poignant relic, the frozen corpse of a climber. We know humans can be preserved in glaciers because of Otzi the Iceman. He was found on a melting snowpack in the Italian Alps in 1991, some 5,300 years after he died. His body had been so perfectly preserved that scientists could determine what he'd eaten for his final 2 meals from the contents of his stomach. Of the more than 180 climbers who died on Everest, as many as 50 were never recovered.
There have been climbers that have been caught in avalanches. They've been trapped in the Khumbu icefall when tons of ice have shifted. It's likely that most of those people are still trapped on the mountain, if you will, entombed in the ice.
Now, The sun and flow of glacial ice have freed one climber. But there are no scientists to greet him, only water and bacteria that make quick work of his remains. Two million years after people, the Cassini spacecraft is long gone. But its stowaways have flourished, because the moon they smashed into was a very special one called Enceladus. It's one of the few places in the solar system believed to have liquid water.
If Cassini were to crash on Enceladus, then it's possible that the bacteria that hitched a ride on the spacecraft could survive in that watery region just below Enceladus' surface. In 1,000 years, you would have a growing colony of bacteria in the Enceladus environment. And over millions of years, and even billions of years, that bacteria might evolve into a whole ecosystem. It would be quite remarkable if the sort of final legacy of our technological society here on Earth was the greening of another moon in the solar system.
Where humans reached for the sky, it appears that the sky was not, in fact, the limit. Cold, dark space has proven surprisingly open to Earth's most unstoppable force: life.